Psalm 22 is one of the most familiar of all the laments because Jesus quotes it from the cross. In fact, it's very difficult to read this psalm without imaging Jesus on the cross. It is a psalm of David, but we don't know exactly when David wrote it. In fact, the details don't seem to connect with anything with any certainty from the life of David. David had seasons where he was on the run from Saul and when he was on the run from his own son Absalom, and it's possible that in the trauma of either one of those events that this psalm was composed, but we really just can't say for certain the circumstances that created the reason for David to write this psalm. What we do know is that it remarkably points us to the cross of Jesus Christ, which is fascinating given that crucifixion was not invented until many centuries after David's life. So David is not describing a crucifixion in his own circumstance, but we can't help but see Jesus and his crucifixion in it. So let's dig into the text. First, as a matter of genre, we identify this as a lament. And so we'll take a look at the elements of a lament that we see here. It has all five. The first is the term of address. Notice how the psalm begins by addressing God in an impersonal way. Eli, Eli, my God, my God. That's not the divine name Yahweh. It's not the covenant name of God, but rather the more distant, general name of God. And so that's appropriate for the meaning here, that he feels that God has forsaken him. When the divine name does occur in verse 8, Lord, Yahweh, notice that it is in the mouths of his enemies, of those that are mocking him. So David does not use the name Yahweh in the first movement of this psalm. The psalm does have three clear movements or stanzas, and here in the first one we see that is primarily about complaint. That is at the center, and it frames this particular stanza. There is a short request in verse 11, be not far from me. And then there are a couple of verses that offer motivation for God to answer his prayer. We said that motivation means rationale. So it is basically kind of bargaining with God, giving God reasons to answer his request. In this case, in verses 3 through 5, David is reminding God, in a sense, that, hey, the community of faith has worshipped you in the past, and you rescued them. So since you've done that, why don't you rescue me? In verses 9 and 10, he can look to his own past and recognize that he has been faithful his entire life, and yet God hasn't rescued him. So why is that? So he's motivating God to act using these terms of motivation. And the second movement of the psalm, again, term of address is notable because in verse 19 we have the name Yahweh, O Lord, be not far off, O you, my help. So two terms of address, though, O Lord and my help. And so clearly something has changed in the psalmist as he's moved from Eli in verse 1 to Yahweh in verse 19. The second movement of the psalm is largely complaint, and then some requests that usher in the third stanza of the psalm, this third movement that is entirely confidence. So when many people think of Psalm 22, they think of the depth of the lament that takes place here. But recognize that fully 1/3 of this psalm is in fact a statement of confidence, of trust. It's very future-oriented, very hopeful. And this is a good reminder of where laments will wind up. In most all cases, a lament is a cycle of processing grief that involves anger, frustration, disappointment, and an expression of that as a form of complaint. It'll also involve some kind of bargaining or motivation, or rationale for why God should accept the psalmist's prayer and change his circumstances. But it invariably ends with a statement of trust and confidence. And we see that on full display here with Psalm 22. Now let's take a look kind of verse by verse and see what's happening. So in the first stanza of this psalm, you can see that it is framed by the concept of distance. Verse 1, the psalmist states it 3 times. Why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me? So far from the words of my groaning. So a threefold repetition. That's a thing in Hebrew poetry. They like the number 3 to emphasize completeness. So he feels completely abandoned. And notice the final verse of this stanza, in verse 11, "Be not far from me, for trouble is near." So while God is distant, the one thing that's not is trouble. Not only is there an expression of God's separation, but also this is not something that's just happening over a short period of time. Verse 2 says, I cry by day, but you do not answer, by night, and I find no rest. So this seems to be an ongoing situation, not just an immediate trauma, but perhaps weeks and weeks and months, and it's a grief that he just can't seem to get over day after day, night after night. So he feels isolated from God and unheard. So he looks to the community, he looks around him, and he looks to the past, and he acknowledges that God has rescued his people in the past. His fathers, the nation of Israel, has experienced God's deliverance over and over again, and he could point to the great stories of his faith to demonstrate that. He could also look to his contemporaries, and he could see that worship was going on, that the temple was full, and the Levites were singing, and yet God didn't seem to hear his prayer. Have you ever been there? Have you ever been in the midst of a congregation that was worshiping, that was experiencing the reality and the presence of God, and yet you couldn't feel more distant? Well, that's where David is. He feels very cut off from the community. Then he turns in verse 6 to himself and a kind of a self-examination. And he says very strongly, "I am a worm and not a man." I would suggest that this is an expression of David's feeling of being cut off from humanity. The second half of the line, he's scorned by mankind and despised by the people. "All who see me mock me, they make mouths," that is, they make faces at me, they wag their heads, they taunt him with these words, "He trusts in Yahweh, let Yahweh deliver him, let him rescue him, for he delights in him." You can just see that's just dripping with sarcasm. And so David, in this central verse 6, I think summarizes his entire position here before God. He says, "I am a worm. I am less than human." Now, as we think about the worm, we might immediately think of like an earthworm, and I suppose that's a possibility here, that he's thinking of, I'm the lowest thing. I'm on the ground. In fact, I'm under the ground. I'm dirty. I'm gross. I am kind of a low life form. But let me suggest that maybe it's even lower than an earthworm. Let me suggest that David here is thinking of himself as a larva, as a maggot, as the lowest of insects. Maggots fed on the decaying bodies of dead things. And so there's also this sense of uncleanness. And so that would seem to fit David's sense of himself, that he is the lowest of the lows. You can't get any lower than a maggot. It's small, it is insignificant, it is very temporary, easily destroyed, feeding on death. So it's a terrible way to think of oneself, and yet that is where David is at. It's about as low as you can get, and he says, "I'm a worm, I'm not a man." So he senses that he's not even human. So there we have 3 senses in which David is abandoned. He's been abandoned by God. He's been abandoned by his community. He doesn't feel closeness from them. In fact, they're taunting him, and he doesn't even feel like he's human anymore. So in his present situation, he looks to the past, and he sees how his community was helped, but he is not being helped right now. And then he can look in verses 9 and 10 to his own personal past. And he says, "You took me from the womb. You made me trust in you at my mother's breast. On you I was cast from my birth. My mother's womb, you've been my God." And David is saying here, God, I have been faithful my entire life. As long as I have been conscious, I have known you, I have trusted in you, and yet this is how you repay me. You might recall Psalm 18. David makes the case that God saved him on the basis of his righteousness. And he said, to the pure, you show yourself pure. To the faithful, you show yourself faithful. And David was saying, I have been faithful. I have not turned away from you. So why have you abandoned me? And so we come full circle to the place that we began. In verse 11, there is none to help. There is no rescue. Not from myself, not from my community, and most of all, God, not from you. I feel utterly abandoned, completely alone. I don't know that you'll ever find a more dramatic description of that condition than you will in the first stanza of this psalm. Now, if in the first stanza David is utterly alone and isolated, the second stanza provides some company. In this stanza, we see that David, in fact, is not alone. He is surrounded. He is far from being alone. He says that many bulls encompass me. Strong bulls of Bashan surround me. These were the bulls of Bashan were in the northeast region of Israel. These were highlands. They were known for their livestock. And in parallel, we see in verse 21 the horns of wild oxen from which he's been rescued. That these were not just cattle, but these were deadly animals, strong, powerful, that could easily gore a person to death. The next animal that we see depicted is in verse 13, that they've opened wide their mouths like a ravening and roaring lion. You also see this corresponding in verse 21, save me from the mouth of the lion. A third animal that is present are the dogs. We see that in verse 16 as well as in verse 20. And of course, as dogs, we don't want to think of the cute little puppies of today, but we're thinking more like hyenas, scavengers, wild dogs, whose main role in life was to clean up after things, to find dead things and devour them, and to lick the blood. So this is an unclean animal, and David perhaps is suggesting here kind of a progression. I'm surrounded by strong bulls. The lions are about to devour me, and then the dogs are going to come along behind them and lick up the blood and clean off the bones. And so we see that this movement of the psalm is framed by animal-like enemies, men who are less than human. They've dehumanized themselves by the way they're acting. They're identified as human enemies in verse 16. A company of evildoers encircles me. So David is surrounded. He's not alone by any measure. Verse 14 begins his description of his physical suffering, and there's just a series of powerful metaphors here that describe his condition. He is poured out like water. That is, he is empty. His bones are out of joint. That he's been stretched and twisted and hyperextended in ways that are painful and limit his ability to move. His heart is like wax. There's no strength. He has no energy, and this could also be just his psychological state as well. He's dried up like a potsherd. Now, potsherd was a discarded piece of pottery left to bake in the sun. So he's describing intense thirst here as well. Verse 16 is notoriously difficult to translate. They have pierced my hands and my feet. Now, that is, as it says here, some Hebrew manuscripts, the Septuagint, the Vulgate, and the Syriac. So this translation, pierced, originated in the Septuagint, and it is the Greek word that is translated dug, D-U-G. So it's the idea of digging into someone's hands and feet with a sharp instrument. And so you can see where the later translation, the Latin Vulgate in the 4th century by Jerome, uses the word pierce in that particular case. However, most Hebrew manuscripts have this translation, like a lion at my hands and my feet. So this interpretation suggests that the lions are just right there, ready to grab his extremities and tear him limb from limb.